Life strikes its deepest blows in the most unexpected moments. My mother. When I lost her, it felt as though the world had stopped. For a while, nothing seemed to matter anymore. That day, I thought everything had come to an end. But a week later, that emptiness left by my loss was replaced by an entirely different void when a package arrived at my mother's house. At that moment, I realized that everything was not just a loss, but a complex mystery that needed to be solved. I felt lost, like a missing piece. After losing my mother, all my routines had vanished in an instant. The silence in the house, the empty chairs, living with my mother's memories and past made every moment even harder. But that morning, it was an ordinary day. The mailman knocked on my door, holding a package in his hands. It was addressed only to me. The fact that this package arrived just a week after my mother's death felt strange to me. At that moment, I had no idea that this package would change my life, that in a way everything would begin to take shape with this box. I opened it, but it took me a while to understand what was inside. The first thing that came out of the box was a yellowed envelope. Inside the envelope was a letter, but I didn't know who it was addressed to or why it was sent. The letter was written in my mother's handwriting, but I realized how strange it had become to receive anything from her over time. The envelope only had my name on it, nothing else. Only a deep emptiness, a reminder of an old writing and the feeling of trying to sense my mother's voice in that writing. At first, I wanted to ignore the box. I thought the items inside were just little mementos telling the story of a lost time. But a voice inside me urged me to examine it more closely. And as I opened it more, it kept giving me reasons to look back and solve the mystery behind everything. The contents of the letter told me this. They wanted me to find you. But who? What had my mother wanted me to find? What secret was she hiding? On one hand, I still felt that something was off. What my mother had decided to leave me wasn't just an ordinary loss, it was part of something much more complex. This package wasn't just a loss, it was the gateway to a puzzle that needed solving. The box was the first clue to a dark secret hidden by the past. Everything would start to intertwine with the secrets coming out of that box. Opening that box would not only bring back a missing piece, but also a lost time. My mother had always been one to keep secrets, but as I began to understand how deep those secrets were, I had the feeling that things would never be the same. The contents of the box were nothing but pieces of a puzzle that needed to be solved. Now all that remained was to find the answer. When and by whom had this veil of secrecy been drawn? Was my mother truly hiding a lost life? Or was her death part of something much bigger? To solve this, I would need to keep opening the box. Perhaps this mystery meant solving the most important part of my mother's life. Once I made the decision to solve it, I would see how deep everything truly was. What do you think was inside that box? What had my mother left me? There was only one step left to find out. If you think you can solve this mystery too, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Because as the veil lifts, everything will get even more complicated. I opened the box, but the contents inside didn't immediately help me understand what was happening. The first thing that came out of the box was a yellowed envelope. Inside the envelope was a letter written in my mother's handwriting. The envelope had only my name written on it. The rest of it was blank. The fact that something like this was sent to me after my mother's death was, in a way, the first sign that everything was beginning to feel strange. At first, I wanted to accept the letter as a simple memento, a piece of the past. But that letter was telling me something else. As I read it, the words seemed to point to a secret waiting for me in a time far away, in another world. The letter from my mother read as follows. They wanted me to find you, but they didn't want you to understand this. Now you will find what you're looking for, but this is only your first step. Follow me, and in time everything will be solved. At first, I didn't understand. No one had told me that my mother had written something like this. My mother's life had always been filled with secrets, but no one had ever explained such a deep mystery to me. There was so much I didn't know about her, and perhaps this letter was the key to the untold story of lost time and years. At that moment, I realized that some of the significant events in my mother's life were not just memories but traces of a mysterious past. There was something hidden, but the package that had been presented to me was just a sign. There was something else inside that box. I needed to find it for myself. Learning about my mother's past, solving her secret. I knew I had to carry this burden no matter what. First, I focused on the photographs. The photos that came from the box were old, likely from my mother's youth. I recognized her in a few of them, but some were very different. There were photos of my mother smiling, surrounded by people I didn't recognize. One of them featured a woman who I thought was a close friend of my mother's. On the back of the photo was a note. Things were so different back then, but now we only look back. In a way, this photo carried not just a memory, but the shadows of the past. Then another photo from my mother's youth caught my attention. On the edge of the photo was a strange symbol. This symbol seemed very familiar. I had seen this symbol on some of my mother's old belongings from my childhood. What did this symbol represent? The meaning of this symbol would soon lead me on a completely new journey after my mother's death. Slowly, I began to discover that this symbol held a deep place in my mother's life. She had used this symbol frequently, yet no one had ever known what it meant. Something was driving me to follow the trail of this symbol. But the real question was, who was the person who taught my mother about this symbol? No one in my mother's life or around her had ever mentioned this relationship with the symbol. Why? Why was this symbol a part of my mother's hidden past? This question began to pull me deeper. Another item from the box was an old agenda. The agenda was quite old and many pages were missing. However, a few pages contained my mother's writings. These writings seemed like the words of someone who wanted to run away from somewhere. One page read, "Run or they'll find you." Another page said, "Don't trust anyone. You can't win this game." The writings were very strange and made no sense, but I was beginning to realize something. There was a world where my mother had somehow hidden herself. This agenda was the clue to the secrets she had kept. Over time, some places related to this agenda began to be researched. It contained a calendar with something written for each week, but it was quite irregular. A place name, a person's name, and a phone number were constantly mentioned. At that moment, I realized I had to take one more step to figure out what all these writings meant. I called the phone number, but no one answered. In the following days, my investigations began to yield more results. One evening, I arranged to meet with one of my mother's old friends. This person had been very close to my mother in the past, but there was always some distance. When I met with him, he didn't say much about my mother's life. But that night I started to sense something strange about the years my mother had lost. This person didn't want to help me fill in the big gaps in my mother's life, but at one point I saw fear in his eyes. That fear was telling me something else. The next day I received a strange message on my phone. "You've learned everything, but it's too late." The message was short and vague. Who had written it? Who were they trying to reach? That moment I realized that the secrets of my mother's life surrounded me. That box was the key to all the secrets my mother had once tried to protect, a mystery that needed to be solved. Solving this mystery, illuminating the dark corners of my mother's life, was my mission, no matter what. No one had ever told me the truth about my mother's past, but now I had more clues to uncover the truth behind everything. No matter how deep it was, solving this dark secret behind my mother's life had become more important than anything else. For a week now, I had been continuing to examine the items inside the mysterious package that arrived after my mother's death. A diary, a letter, photos and symbols. These were telling me so much, but what exactly were they trying to convey? Every clue I found about my mother's past brought me one step closer, but it also showed how complicated everything was. My eyes wandered over the photos, trying to understand each symbol, spending hours deciphering each word. Yet every time I found myself taking a step back. At first I decided to follow the symbol on the photos. It was a very old mark, one my mother had used even during her childhood. But something was missing. Why did my mother use this symbol so often? What did it mean? My mother must have lived a secretive life. To uncover her secrets, I needed more clues. So I started researching the other people I saw in the photos. Many of the photos had names written on the back, but I didn't recognize a few of the people. One person seemed to be one of my mother's childhood friends. Her first and last name was written on the back of the photo, but I knew nothing about her. When I searched her name online, the only thing that came up was a missing person. There were a few old news reports, but they were brief and vague. I couldn't find any in-depth information about this person, but behind the smiling faces in the photos, something more was hidden. Something was being concealed. Slowly, I continued to examine each item that had to do with my mother's past. The diary strangely had a few pages missing. Which pages were missing almost seemed to have a meaning. Certain weeks pointed to periods with significant events. These missing pages showed me something. My mother had recorded important moments and times spent with certain people, but some of them had been covered up. This cover-up seemed to be a message that something needed to be hidden. One night, a page in my mother's diary presented me with a chilling reality. In the corner of the page, there was an address I had never forgotten. This address pointed to a street with a small apartment on it. It was a place I had heard of before, but had never been. The street was located in an old neighborhood, and in that neighborhood there was a building that had been abandoned for a long time. Could this building be an important part of my mother's hidden life? The writings in the diary subtly pointed to this building. I immediately decided to go to that street. The next day, I set out for that address. Located outside the city in a rather desolate area, this street had turned into a neighborhood that was slowly deteriorating. The buildings were very close to each other, but most of them had been abandoned. This place seemed to carry the memory of a lost past. When I arrived at the exact location of the address, I stood in front of an apartment block that appeared to have been unused for years. This building must have been one of the places my mother often wrote about in her notes. There had once been someone or something important in her life here, but what was it? The building was quite chaotic. The entrance door, made of broken, dirty glass, led to an abandoned space. I carefully inspected the surroundings. The door was old and weak. I felt the need to go inside. For a moment I hesitated. Entering could be my only chance to uncover the truths my mother had hidden. I forced the door open. As I took my first step inside, I was greeted only by darkness and an abandoned environment. Old objects lost in dust showed the marks of time left behind. I ventured deeper inside. At that moment, an old painting on the wall caught my attention. The painting depicted a family photo in black and white. On the edge of the photo were my mother and several people I didn't recognize. As I stood in front of this painting, my suspicions grew. Who were these people? What did this photo represent? I saw many different people together, but these were definitely part of the secrets in my mother's life. I slowly took the painting down and began reading what was written on the back. "Don't leave us, everything has a price," was written there. This writing was a clue to one of the darkest points of my mother's past. It wasn't just a threat, it was a binding obligation deeply connected to her past. I continued deeper into the building. With every step, the place became more terrifying. At that moment, I saw a door down the corridor. The door was very old and rusty. After several attempts, I managed to open it. The door led to a hidden room. Inside, it was dark, filled with abandoned objects. But as I started to explore the room, I found a desk. On the desk was an old file. I carefully opened it. Inside there was a long list. The list consisted of names of important people from my mother's past. But one name was different from the others. This name was also that of the person I had seen in the photo. This completely stunned me. I slowly looked at the other papers in the file. The papers were solid proof that my mother had lived another life. That life wasn't the one we knew. My mother had been living in a hidden world, leading a life no one knew about, and it seemed this file carried the traces of that life. Once again, I remembered the phrase my mother had written in her old notes. "They wanted me to find you." Now I could see the meaning of that writing more clearly. My mother was running from her past, fleeing a burden she had to carry from it. But what was that burden? What was in this file? Why were these names and events affecting my mother so deeply in the dark corners of her life? After spending a few more minutes in that hidden room, I put the file in my pocket. Every piece, every clue was leading me closer to the truth. But one question remained. What would this file and all this mystery reveal? As I continued on my way, I looked at the other writings on the back of the photo. One caught my attention. "Don't let them find me, everything has a price." This writing pointed to something my mother feared even while running from her past. What was this price? Why did it scare her so much? Could it show me what was really threatening her? My eyes slowly moved over the writing again. I carefully opened another file. Like the previous ones, it left the same ominous impression. It was hard to describe. This was part of a hidden life. The portrait of someone who had lost their identity, someone who had been lost for years. All of this terrified me, but my mother had lived a life like this, and I had no choice but to keep exploring. For a while, as I researched my mother's hidden past, it took on a dark, uncertain, and dangerous turn. There was a constant feeling that something was watching me, as if every step I took was being monitored. My eyes began to wander over every detail, realizing that I was missing something each time. Every clue, every letter, every object whispered something to me, but it never seemed to present a complete picture. After finding the file in that room, something unexpected happened. It was a wake-up call, a summons. The unveiling of my mother's lost and concealed life could bring an end to all these mysteries. My previous findings showed me a secret, but I still couldn't figure out where it was leading me. Suddenly, everything seemed to accelerate. My steps grew heavier. In pursuit of this lost life, I was entering a dark path that no one else had trodden. I found myself in a world where everything was lost and hidden. Everywhere, including that abandoned building bearing my mother's name. There was so much, people, pasts, pains, all erased and concealed. What was the reason behind my mother hiding this life? What had happened? Why had she disappeared? Without the night merging into day, after spending a day in that old apartment, my suspicions deepened. The information I had found in the file kept spinning in my mind. My mother's lost life strangely seemed to overlap with my own life at times. But my biggest fear was that my mother would leave without ever explaining all these secrets. Among those secrets was something threatening me. That threat was, in fact, a danger no one had ever confronted. That night I had to descend into the depths of the place where my mother had disappeared, into the abandoned building. The new address I had found during my previous investigations had led me here. This place was where the lost past had been trapped in the dusty shelves of history. The building was a place where the structures had decayed with time. The ceilings began to collapse, and in every corner the ghosts of lost lives seemed to reside. With every step, the remnants of a life that once existed were following me. I moved through the building. Passing through doors, walls, and old furniture, I suddenly noticed that a door was open. The door appeared dark and enclosed. I entered and took a deep breath to understand the truth of everything. The room was completely empty, but on the upper corner of the wall there was a cryptic writing. The writing was done in the same symbols my mother had last used. "Life requires a price," it said. This was the starting point. Now I could see it. My mother had to pay a price, and that price must carry a very big secret. Facing this secret, no matter how dangerous it was, I had to find the truth behind my mother's disappearance. The room seemed to be telling me something, but something was missing. This had once been a security room. When I looked at the old yellowed papers on the desk, I noticed a large file was missing. What was that file? Why had my mother hidden it so well? What was inside that file? My questions began to multiply in my mind. Within seconds, I noticed one last thing. Behind the door, there was a large security cabinet. I tried to force it open. After a few attempts, the door opened with a final effort, and inside I saw a large old box. I pulled the box inside and opened it, and my eyes fixated on a document inside. It had my mother's name on it, and at first glance it appeared to be just a long list. But this list was definitely not normal. The names, addresses, and codes inside were deeply connected. I realized that my mother had been involved in a great danger. As I read through the list, I began to see a connection to the missing people. Each one was someone important in my mother's life. Many of those people had disappeared or been killed. I understood that my mother was seriously connected to those names and events. But what did this mean? I needed to understand how important these people were in my mother's lost life. And then, the moment I had been waiting for arrived. From the depths of the box, I found another long-lost photograph of my mother. In the center of the photo, there was my mother with a group of people. These people looked like the ones listed. This photo had been taken with just a few people, but my mother's face was quite sad. At that moment, everything had a meaning. My mother had been hiding something from them. That hidden thing contained a lost truth that had brought us here. Taking a deep breath, I examined the photograph again. In that moment, a thought passed through my mind and everything seemed to fall into place. My mother was not just a victim. She had willingly entered this hidden world. And the scariest part was my mother had made a choice. That choice was important enough to change all of our lives. My eyes moved from the photograph to the papers and then back to the file. Slowly, I realized that everything here was built on deception, not on forgiveness. Every move my mother made was not a protection, but rather a trap. This was a game, and the rules of the game had unfortunately become clear too late. In my subconscious, I felt that something was speeding up for one last time. If that file had affected my mother's life and death, now I was approaching the final chapter of everything. Suddenly, all the mysteries came together, and there was only one path left to reach the final conclusion. The truth behind my mother's disappearance had been in every step she had taken, every doubt she had, and every clue she had left behind throughout her life. But this journey had become darker, more complex, and more dangerous with each passing day. Now, with my mother's disappearance, I realized that everything was connected. That photo, that file, that old security room. Everything served a purpose. But I still didn't understand what that purpose was. That night I spent it deep within the place where my mother had disappeared, in the security room. After carefully examining the box and the documents inside, I thought everything had become clear. My mother had indeed once been a part of a crime syndicate. This organization stretched from human experiments to missing persons. My mother had entered this dark world to survive. But over time, the price of having a place in this dark world had become heavier. That price contained the threats and missing lives that would later emerge. There was only one file, the most important one, and this file kept a record of all the recent deals my mother had made. As I read the document, my mother's fear grew within me. She had never truly escaped from this world. There was a connection between the names of all those missing people, their addresses, and the details of the events. My mother had risked her life over time to solve these connections, and eventually I had reached the point where the story had begun. That lost life was hidden in this file. At first, there was something I didn't understand. My mother had tried to escape from this crime syndicate in some way. Her decision to escape had made her even more vulnerable. And now, I was at the final stage of that escape plan. The contents of the file were revealing the identity of the person my mother had planned to escape with. This person was someone very close to her. perhaps one of her closest. No one had ever realized who this person was. Who was this person, and why had my mother hidden them so much? I couldn't wait any longer to get the answer to these questions. Whoever this person was, I had to risk everything to find them. But to solve this biggest question in my mother's lost life, I had to take the right step. My goal was to follow the clues behind those secret files. I needed to solve the code written on the last page of that file. The code was actually a record of the last-minute deals my mother had made, and each encrypted message was offering me more clues. One night, just before dawn, I solved the code. As I deciphered it, everything that had been spinning in my head became clear. I knew this person. This person was my mother's closest friend, someone she had known for years, someone she thought she could trust. But the strange part was, this person had also disappeared. This person had become involved in the criminal network with my mother, but unfortunately, unlike the others, this person hadn't been able to escape the network. This person was now threatening my life as well, because the missing person had actually become someone much more dangerous. This person represented the power behind everything. They had become an incomprehensible dark figure. They wanted to settle the score with me. But no one could predict the outcome of this confrontation. Now there was only one choice left: face this person. No matter how dangerous they were, I had to go to the place where everything would come to an end. To uncover all the dark secrets behind my mother's disappearance, I had to step into that hidden world one last time. Chasing the lost memories through secret files and old photos had led me to the final point. At this point, everything had to be revealed. It had to come to an end. This person was my greatest enemy. Facing them, finding that lost life, and making one last effort to ensure that my mother wouldn't be lost forever was necessary. And at that moment, all the doors to reclaim my mother's lost life opened one by one. I was ready to face that person. When I found that person, the only thing they said to me was, "Unless you kill me, everything will start again." This was the moment when everything ended, but in a sense, everything also began again. In that moment, with all the darkness within me, I found a solution that would end my mother's lost life. The end of everything is the beginning, and my mother's lost life reshaped itself one last time. But unfortunately, this world would remain dark, and I would continue to fight in this world to see the truths. What do you think about this? Let us know in the comments.